August 17, 1967. Da Nang Air Base, South Vietnam. The morning haze hung low over the coastal hills, a pale veil of humidity blurring the line between sky and sea. Captain Robert Ellison, U.S. Air Force Technical Intelligence Division, wiped his palms on his flight suit as the hangar doors groaned open. Inside, under the harsh glare of halogen floodlights, stood something no one at Da Nang expected to see intact. A Soviet-built Il-28 Il-28 Beagle bomber, painted in the fading green-gray camouflage of the North Vietnamese Air Force. It had been captured almost miraculously. 2 days earlier, the aircraft had landed at an abandoned strip near Vinh Linh after sustaining engine trouble during a ferry flight. The crew had vanished into the jungle. What remained was the first complete Il-28 the Americans had ever obtained in Southeast Asia, an artifact of another era. Ellison circled the bomber slowly, notebook in hand. At first glance, it was impressive, sleek, twin-jet, swept tailplane, almost elegant in its simplicity. But as he climbed the ladder to the cockpit, that impression began to dissolve. The canopy framing was thick and crude. Instruments were analog, painted dials and mechanical needles straight out of the 1950s. There were no digital readouts, no radar warning receivers, no electronic countermeasure pods. The gun sight was an optical reflex model, not a radar-linked system. "Feels like I'm sitting in a museum," Ellison murmured. The crew seats were thin aluminum shells with no armor plating. Oxygen bottles were bolted to the floor. The wiring looms were cloth-wrapped, something unseen in American aircraft since the Korean War. Most astonishing were the fuel tanks. When Ellison opened the inspection panels, the metal was bare. No self-sealing rubber, no protective layer. Just unarmored aluminum alloy. He looked at his sergeant. "They built a jet bomber around the same logic as a gas can," he said quietly. The engineering report later noted, "Fuel cells are simple aluminum structures, no evidence of self-sealing compounds. Internal protection non-existent. Any perforation likely to ignite vaporized fuel. Crew survivability minimal." For Ellison, the discovery wasn't merely technical. It was philosophical. The Il-28 represented an approach to war fundamentally alien to the one he served. It was a machine designed for deterrence, not endurance. A bomber conceived in a world that expected to burn quickly. Moscow, 1947. The Soviet Union was a nation still bleeding from 27 million dead, rebuilding from ruins, and facing a new enemy, the West. In November of that year, the Council of Ministers issued a set of urgent requirements to aircraft designer Sergei Ilyushin. Develop a twin-jet tactical bomber capable of delivering a 3,000-kilogram payload at 800 kilometers per hour over a combat radius of 1,200 kilometers. The bomber had to be simple, cheap, and mass-producible. At the time, the USSR had almost no experience with operational jet aircraft. Their piston-engine Tu-2s and PE-2s were obsolete against the new generation of Western fighters. Ilyushin's team faced a brutal equation. To meet performance demands with the limited metallurgy and engine technology of the post-war USSR, everything not essential had to be sacrificed: armor, redundancy, safety. They used two new Klimov VK-1 engines, derivative of Britain's Rolls-Royce Nene that the Soviets had copied. The engines were reliable enough, but thirsty. To reach range targets, the aircraft needed vast internal fuel capacity. Weight became the decisive enemy. The engineers proposed adding self-sealing fuel tanks, but the calculations were merciless. The weight penalty, nearly 400 kilograms, would cut range by almost 20%. Ilyushin's chief designer, Vladimir Kokonaki, made the fateful decision: omit them. Range first, crew protection later, or never. Production prototypes flew in July 1948. Soviet test pilots described the aircraft as honest but unforgiving. It was fast for its time, nearly 900 kilometers per hour in level flight, but demanded precision. There was no automation, no hydraulic boost to the ailerons. Pilots flew it by brute force. The first units entered service in 1950, just as the Korean War erupted. By Western standards, it was already outdated. American jet bombers like the B-45 Tornado and Canberra featured radar navigation, pressurized cabins, and electronic countermeasures. The Il-28 had none of that, but it could be built in hundreds per month. Soviet doctrine did not prize survivability, it prized saturation. Marshal Vasily Sokolovsky, Deputy Chief of Staff, summarized it bluntly in a 1952 planning memo. A bomber exists not to return. It exists to deliver its payload. Replacement is cheaper than invulnerability. That sentence would define the Beagle's legacy from Eastern Europe to the jungles of Vietnam. By the early 1960s, the Il-28 had become the export workhorse of the Soviet bloc. North Korea, China, Egypt, and Albania all flew them. When the Democratic Republic of Vietnam sought a bomber for psychological and strategic effect, to show that it too possessed a jet air force, Moscow supplied 4 Il-28s in late 1964, together with training crews from China. But by then, the aircraft was a relic. American F-4 Phantoms could outrun it by 500 kilometers per hour. Surface-to-air missiles could destroy it long before it reached its release point. Still, the symbolism mattered. Hanoi wanted an image of parity, a weapon that could reach deep into South Vietnam or strike American ships offshore. In April 1965, 2 North Vietnamese crews completed their first training flights from Gia Lam Air Base. One of them, Captain Tran Duc Bao, recorded in his notebook, "Our aircraft are old, but they are strong. The instructors say it was built to fight Americans before the Americans were ready. Maybe that time comes again." They had no idea how outdated their machines really were. Back in the Da Nang hangar, Ellison's inspection continued through the afternoon. He noted the crude welding seams on the bomb bay doors, the manually operated gun turret controlled by mechanical linkages rather than hydraulics. The tail gun sight was purely optical, with no computing gun sight. He dictated into his recorder, "Design emphasizes manufacturability and simplicity. Systems are robust but archaic. Little regard for crew ergonomics or damage tolerance. Entire philosophy appears centered on expendability." That word, expendability, echoed through the technical intelligence community after his report circulated. To American engineers accustomed to aircraft like the B-57 Canberra or the F-105, which embedded complex redundancy systems to save crews, the Il-28 was shocking in its austerity. Yet, in its simplicity, there was a certain logic. The Soviets had built a bomber that nations like North Vietnam could maintain with minimal infrastructure. No complex electronics, no fragile radar arrays, no need for specialized test benches. The Beagle could operate from rough airstrips, be refueled with drums, and loaded by hand. It was, Ellison realized, a bomber for poor wars, durable in logistics, disposable in battle. As he finished his inspection, the afternoon monsoon rolled in, hammering the hangar roof with heavy tropical rain. The sound drowned out the base traffic and seemed to blur time itself. Ellison looked once more at the dull green bomber, water beading on its faded star insignia. This aircraft had been designed for the nuclear age, yet here it stood in a conventional jungle war, where speed and range no longer meant survival. The thought struck him as he closed his notebook. This thing was obsolete before the men who flew it were even born. He didn't yet know how prophetic that sentence would become. Hanoi, December 1965. The sound of distant thunder was not weather but artillery practice on the city's outskirts. At Gia Lam Air Base, ground crews worked by lantern light, preparing the Il-28s for what the High Command called Operation Lightning Bamboo. The goal was simple: conduct a night strike on American logistics depots south of Vinh. The objective was not destruction, it was symbolism. Hanoi wanted to show that it could strike deep, that it possessed a jet bomber fleet equal to the enemy's. There were 4 aircraft in total, 2 operational, 2 held for training. Only 6 qualified crews existed in the entire People's Air Force. The Soviet and Chinese advisors who had once trained them were gone, recalled after early skirmishes with U.S. forces. What remained were men who understood that each takeoff was an act of faith. Captain Tran Duc Bao flew the lead bomber that night. His logbook, recovered decades later, recorded, "We took off at 23:42. Cloud cover low, full darkness. Instruments primitive. Radar shows only noise. We navigate by compass and time." They climbed to 9,000 meters, heading south along the coast, then turned inland. At that altitude, Bao could see faint flickers of lightning over the mountains, and, farther out, the faint glow of American radar tracking. The Americans knew. By 1965, The U.S. Air Defense Command had already linked radar coverage from ships in the Gulf of Tonkin to interceptor squadrons in Thailand. When the Il-28s crossed the 18th parallel, they were spotted instantly. Two F-4C Phantoms scrambled from Ubin Air Base. At 017, one of the Phantoms acquired radar lock. The missile warning systems the Americans took for granted, the shrill tones, the flickering lights, did not exist in Bao's cockpit. He had no idea he'd been targeted. Seconds later, an AM-7 Sparrow struck the left engine. Witnesses from coastal observation posts saw the flash. The bomber disintegrated midair. There were no parachutes. The second Il-28 escaped by diving into cloud cover and jettisoning its bombs over farmland. It landed safely at Gia Lam before dawn. The propaganda newspapers the next morning still claimed mission accomplished. In truth, it was the last operational combat mission ever flown by a North Vietnamese Il-28. For American intelligence, that one wreck changed everything. Fragments were recovered from a shallow coastal lagoon and analyzed at Clark Air Base, Philippines. The results confirmed what Ellison had suspected at Da Nang months later. No radar warning receiver, no countermeasures, no self-sealing tanks, no electronic warfare capacity whatsoever. A memo dated February 2, 1966, summarized the finding. Aircraft unsuitable for modern contested environments. Design philosophy predicated on pre-missile era assumptions. Losses inevitable under radar-integrated defense. In other words, the Beagle belonged to 1950, not 1965. Still, Hanoi refused to retire it. Propaganda photographs showed the remaining aircraft lined up proudly at Noi Bai airfield, bomb bays open, red stars gleaming. They were never used in combat again, but they remained a psychological weapon. The illusion of a bomber threat forced U.S. forces to dedicate interceptor patrols and radar surveillance that could have been used elsewhere. Soviet advisors, writing privately to Moscow, were less romantic. Colonel Yuri Andropov, no relation to the later KGB chief, wrote from Hanoi in March 1966. The Il-28 is out of time and place. Against American fighters, it is like a blind horse on a motorway. Yet the Vietnamese commanders persist. They value the image of the machine more than its effect. Andropov's frustration was understandable. To the Soviets, the Beagle had once been a symbol of progress, the USSR's first truly modern jet bomber. But by the 1960s, it had become a training aircraft, a museum piece still fighting a modern war. April 1966, Gia Lam. Maintenance logs reveal the slow decay. One aircraft grounded due to fuel leaks from corroded tanks. Another cannibalized for parts. The third suffered an oxygen system failure that nearly killed its crew. Without spare engines or modern avionics, ground crews improvised with aluminum patches and tape. A technician named Lu Hong Min kept a small notebook. We work all night patching holes. There are no replacements. The engines smoke on startup. When we taxi, the dust rises like ghosts. But they tell us the planes will fly again. They never did. By early 1967, the Il-28 unit, officially 921st Bomber Training Squadron, was disbanded. Its surviving crews were reassigned to reconnaissance or transport duties. The bombers were rolled into hardened shelters, their engines drained of fuel, their tires deflating slowly under the weight of forgotten steel. Meanwhile, American analysts like Captain Ellison kept studying the captured example at Da Nang. He was fascinated by what it represented, not the aircraft itself, but the mindset behind it. He wrote in his 1967 report to Coffin Intelligence, "This aircraft is an artifact of total war engineering. It assumes infinite manpower and finite time. The design tells a story of a system that expected to lose machines faster than it could protect them." He compared it to the US F-105 Thunder Chief, which carried complex hydraulic backups, redundant electrical circuits, and an ejection seat that could fire even underwater. The Il-28 had none of these. If its canopy jammed, the crew simply died inside. But the contrast wasn't purely technological. It was ideological. The North Vietnamese, and the Soviet doctrine they inherited, saw warfare as collective endurance. Crews were components of a larger machine. The loss of individuals was tragic but acceptable if the system survived. In American doctrine, by contrast, the individual was the system. Each pilot was a multi-million-dollar investment. Survival equaled continuity of experience. That divergence of values became literal in metal. One nation armored its planes, the other armored its cause. In August 1966, Hanoi staged a massive public ceremony at Bach Mai Airfield. The two surviving Il-28s were rolled onto the tarmac, banners draped across their fuselages. Children waved flags. Loudspeakers blared patriotic songs. The announcer declared, "Our jet bombers stand ready to strike the aggressor wherever he hides." Few realized the engines were non-functional. The bombers were empty shells, symbols of defiance painted in fading green. Still, to the men who had flown them, the ceremony was not meaningless. Captain Tran Duc Bao's surviving navigator, Nguyen Van Lock, later told an interviewer in 1989, "We knew our bombers were old. But when we taxied past the crowd, we felt we were part of history. For a moment, we believed they still feared us." That illusion was all that remained of the Il-28's power. From 1965 to 1967, no more than 5 combat sorties were attempted by North Vietnamese Il-28s. 3 ended in mechanical failure, 1 in total loss, 1 aborted before crossing the 17th parallel. Of the 18 trained bomber crewmen, at least 11 were killed in accidents or intercepts. Not a single confirmed hit was scored on U.S. forces. Yet American radar operators continued to monitor possible jet bomber threats for the rest of the war. The ghost of the Beagle haunted their screens, a phantom of Soviet design that never truly appeared again. By late 1967, the captured aircraft at Da Nang had become an academic curiosity. Students from Wright-Patterson's Foreign Technology Division arrived to take measurements. They peeled back fuselage panels, examined the primitive rivet work, photographed the cockpit. When they removed one of the side plates, they discovered a small engraved tag. Plant number 30, Moscow, 1952. It had been built 15 years before the Vietnam War even began. Ellison stood there for a long time, staring at that tag. To him, it wasn't just metal. It was a time capsule, a relic of a vanished era of strategic thinking that somehow had bled into a jungle conflict 2 decades later. He jotted a final note in his field log. The enemy flew a bomber designed for a world that no longer exists. But perhaps that's the point. War always uses the tools of the past to fight for the future. Outside, the tropical evening closed in. The captured Il-28 sat in the orange glow of the hangar lights, silent, obsolete, and strangely dignified, a machine that had never truly belonged to the war it was asked to fight. March 1973. The air at Da Nang smelled of salt and jet fuel when a team of American engineers gathered beside a gray, rain-streaked hulk beneath a steel canopy. The Il-28 that had once been North Vietnam's proudest bomber now sat motionless, its paint faded, its tires half buried in dust. For years it had been left to rust in silence, a relic of an age that no longer existed. Now it was being prepared for shipment to the United States. Major Robert Ellison watched in silence as the cranes lifted the fuselage onto a flatbed trailer. He had first examined this aircraft 6 years earlier, when it was still warm from flight. Then, he had seen it as a curiosity. Now, it felt like a ghost from another century. At Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, the Il-28 was taken apart piece by piece. Engineers studied its rivets, its crude welds, the strange absence of protective systems that Western aircraft took for granted. They found no radar warning receiver, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no electronic countermeasures. It was all muscle and no nerve. Every panel told the same story: simplicity above safety, function above survival. The final report called it a dead end in bomber design. But Ellison thought the phrase was too narrow. To him, the Il-28 was not a failed machine. It was the embodiment of a different moral world. In the late 1940s, the Soviet Union had rebuilt from ashes, obsessed with speed and quantity. The Il-28 had been born from that logic, an aircraft that could be produced in hundreds, flown by men whose lives were measured in missions, not years. The absence of self-sealing tanks and armor wasn't an oversight, it was policy. Moscow strategists had reasoned that victory would belong to the nation that could lose the most and still keep fighting. A bomber did not exist to come home. It existed to deliver its payload, and if it burned in the process, another would take its place. The Beagle's skin carried that faith in its aluminum bones. By 1975, when Saigon fell and the last North Vietnamese Il-28s taxied for the victory parade in Hanoi, their engines coughed smoke like dying lungs. They hadn't flown a combat mission in years, but their presence on the runway sent the message Hanoi wanted, proof that the nation had endured. Crowds cheered as the old bombers rolled past, banners fluttering. To them, these machines were dragons of the sky. To the pilots, they were fossils. Nguyen Van Lock, once a navigator on the first failed Il-28 raid in 1965, stood beside one of the aircraft and felt a strange mixture of pride and sorrow. "We knew they were useless," he said many years later. "But when we heard the engine start, we felt our struggle had been worth something." Across the ocean, the captured Beagle stood reassembled inside an American museum hangar. Most visitors ignored it, walking past toward the gleaming phantoms and stratofortresses. The Il-28 seemed small among giants, an artifact from a simpler, harsher world. Yet Ellison visited it often, quietly standing before its dull green fuselage. He saw in it not failure, but philosophy. Every nation built its weapons in its own image. The Il-28's unarmored wings reflected a belief in expendability. Its plane controls spoke of a system that valued obedience over initiative. The Americans built aircraft to save their pilots. The Soviets built aircraft that could be replaced faster than their pilots could be trained. Both sides called it efficiency. Only history could judge which one was right. The technicians who had once opened the bomber's panels found burn marks along the internal fuel lines, evidence of an old engine fire hastily patched with foil and epoxy. On a bulkhead, they found a warning stenciled in Cyrillic: "Do not exceed 0.84 Mach, vibration dangerous." Below it, barely visible, someone had written in pencil, "For the motherland." That faint handwriting, left by an unknown mechanic half a world away, struck Ellison more deeply than the engineering diagrams ever could. It was the human fingerprint inside a machine designed for sacrifice. Years passed, the Cold War cooled, and the world moved on. In the 1990s, declassified Soviet archives revealed that even the engineers who built the Il-28 had doubted it. One of them, Boris McKean, admitted in an interview, "We knew it was obsolete before it flew. But we were told to build something now, not something perfect. It was better to have a bomber that could die than no bomber at all." In that single sentence, Ellison thought, lay the essence of 20th century warfare. The Il-28 had been born from fear, flown with faith, and ended as a museum piece. Today, one of the surviving North Vietnamese Il-28s rests in the Hanoi Air Museum. Its wheels have sunk into the concrete, its canopy sealed with grime. Tourists pass it without noticing. Sometimes an old mechanic or former pilot will pause beside it, touch the metal, and whisper that it once guarded the skies of their youth. The aircraft no longer frightens anyone, but it still commands a quiet respect. It is not beautiful, but it is honest. When Ellison retired in 1988, he wrote one final reflection for the Air Force Historical Office. He recalled the moment at Da Nang when he had first opened the bomber's wing panel and seen the thin, unprotected fuel tanks gleaming in the tropical light. "That was when I understood," he wrote, "that we weren't just fighting another country. We were fighting another idea of what a human life was worth." His last line became famous in military ethics lectures. "Technology is moral philosophy expressed in steel. Every rivet holds a belief." The Il-28 held its belief stubbornly to the end. That range mattered more than return, that courage could replace protection, that men were as expendable as machines. But history had its own verdict. The wars that followed demanded precision, not attrition. Pilots were replaced by drones, and nations no longer measured strength in lives lost. The Beagle, once a symbol of endurance, became a cautionary relic. Still, there is something haunting in its simplicity. In its riveted frame and unarmored wings lives a truth older than the jet age: that every weapon is a reflection of the values that created it. The Il-28 did not survive its time, but its silence speaks louder than its engines ever did. It reminds us that wars are not only fought with machines, but with the choices that shape them. And those choices, like the ghosts of old bombers rusting in the monsoon rain, never truly disappear.